What's up, everybody out there in YouTube land? Wrath2501 here. Alright, guys, so we've got a video from Squib Jim, complete history of the administrator, okay? And yeah, and considering her story is now literally over, and now it's time. So, yeah, this is by Squib Jim. So, yeah, let's see what he has to say about the administrator. Alright, and go.
This is the administrator. Real name?
It was.
Helen. Or is it Elizabeth? Or Emily? Or, more likely than not any of those.
Probably.
She is the mysterious overseer of the mercenaries who goes by many names, whose role and motives only became more mysterious the more we learned about her. In fact, even the alias Emily doesn't seem to have a very consistent backstory.
And it turns out her
Allegedly,
motives were all bullshit
will
anyway.
left his estate to Emily, but that was later changed to Elizabeth. But I can't find any proof of that being true. But then randomly the name Emily did come back in the final comic, so I don't know what to believe. And speaking
I
of,
know who you are.
Yeah, since the last video I did on the Mann family, the final comic has come out, which I'm sure is something that surprised
Don't
a lot of us.
worry. The comic reading is coming.
Administrator
Rocker's going to be
towards
getting
the
you
end
some
of the
more
series,
lines soon,
and
guys.
I'm
So
actually
don't worry
glad I
about it.
waited
You've just
this
been
time
going through
because
some
her
shit
story
lately.
has officially wrapped up. So if you couldn't already guess, this video does contain a lot of spoilers for the final comic if you haven't read it yet. And real quick, if you do like these videos and want to help out the channel, I do have a Patreon with things like early videos, special Discord stuff, and a Discord raffle every month where I will give away TF2 items and even some real TF2 merchandise. So you can check that out if you're interested. Alright, anyway, starting at the very beginning, the Administrator was always one of the original 10 characters when Team Fortress 2 launched. With her, of course, being the only one that isn't actually playable. She's just the announcer, the person telling you what's going on for the purposes of gameplay.
I saw it.
Who she is and what relevance she had to this story is completely unknown, and part of that is because TF2 really didn't have a story. All she was just a voice. One played by Ellen McLean, who is also known for playing GLaDOS, and is married to John Patrick Laurie, the voice of the sniper.
Cool.
But the first time we would hear about the Administrator outside of her voice lines in the game was from her directly in a blog post on February 18th, 2009. This blog post is attributed to the TF2 announcer and is signed by the Administrator, which I believe is the first time she would ever be referred to as such. Prior to this, she was mainly just known as the announcer, but from here on, she'd be given her official title of the Administrator. And in this blog post, written from her point of view, she condemns players for exploiting a bug that would allow players to wield items on invalid classes, and punishes those that did it by losing their unlockable items for a month. And that's interesting, though unfortunately I can't actually find any footage of this exploit from that era. But it's cool to know that it existed. And that blog post was actually followed up just 5 days later with another one written by the Administrator, this time chastising people who used external applications to unlock achievements to get achievement items. It took that stuff seriously back then. But these blog posts would begin to give us a little bit more insight into her as a character, especially her more cruel and disciplinarian tendencies. I mean, after all, her favorite magazine is Punishment Monthly. And I believe this is the first time that we would learn that she's a shooter. Because don't forget, at this point, we have no idea what she looks like. Though later that year, in October 2009, we would see our first glimpse of the Mann family portrait. And in it, we would see an older woman sitting beside Zephaniah Mann, a woman that his will refers to as Elizabeth. And what would have been quite
Who is that on the right, though?
Is that Elizabeth looks an awful lot like the woman in this picture. This is artwork by Heather Campbell, also known as Makani, originally published on her DeviantArt page in November 2008, as her interpretation of what the announcer in TF2 might look like. As it turns out, this fan art was making the rounds at Valve, and they bought the design from Heather, and eventually hired her to draw the comics.
That's awesome!
But her design for the announcer was instead used for Elizabeth in 1850. Then, coincidentally, a very, very similar looking woman would appear in the War comic 2 months later. And this would be the first time that a face was officially put to the Administrator, as far as we would have known. And her appearance is almost identical to that of Elizabeth's, as well as Heather's original artwork, with the general idea at the time being that Elizabeth must be some kind of relative of the Administrator. I mean, after all, Elizabeth was alive in 1850, and the Administrator was alive over 100 years later in 1968. So they can't be the same person.
Right.
And that War comic, which was the first multi-page comic, actually throws a ton of information at us. This comic was the first time that it was made explicitly clear that the Administrator was one single person, announcing to both red and blue teams simultaneously, and the first time that she'd become associated with the color purple. You know, a combination of those two colors. This would also be the first time we would see one of her assistants, Miss Pauling, as well as one of her trench coat-wearing henchmen, who would also show up from time to time. This would also be the first time that she was referred to as Helen. And while we have seen the name TF Industries pop up on things prior, this would be the first time that we would learn that it's the administrator running it. But the basic plot of the comic is that the Red Demo Man and the Blue Soldier become friends outside of work, and that the administrator wants to turn them against each other so they don't begin discussing and asking questions about her. Which is something that she is strongly opposed to. Whatever the administrator is up to, she is very intent on keeping it a secret. Though the mercenaries don't really seem to care all that much. I mean, Demo Man only seems to know vaguely who she is, just referring to her as the angry lady who's always screaming at us. And in a later comic, when Heavy infiltrates her secret base, she expects that he's there to kill her, but he's only there to ask for more weapons. But overall, the actual plot of the war comic doesn't have...
Heavy tracked her down, he's smart.
As a whole. But like I said, there is a lot of broader lore that is first introduced in that comic. It even hints at a possible romantic relationship that Helen may have had with Saxon Hale, which she does not confirm or deny.
Bruh.
Helen also has a picture of the Mann family portrait in her office, the one with Elizabeth in it, which would have given us even more of a reason to think that they're related if we couldn't already tell. And when we initially learned of Elizabeth's existence, along with the will of Zephaniah Mann, we also learned that he left her the rest and residue of my estate, including all deeds, accounts, debts, public and private, my tobacco plantation, and what remains of the fortune. Zephaniah also refers to her as his dearest maidservant. So clearly Elizabeth and Zephaniah had a pretty close relationship. And Elizabeth's connection with the Mann family will be expanded upon in 2010 with the Engineer Update's Loose Cannon comic. We get a recap of Zephaniah's will reading in 1850, where he gives his land to Redmond and Plutarch to share. We then cut to 40 years later, when Plutarch Man asks Radigan Coninger, the engineer's grandfather, to build him a life-extending machine in order to outlast his brother, after his attempt at a quick land grab turned into a decades-long gravel war. Radigan agrees, and upon returning to his workshop, is greeted by who we can assume is Elizabeth, who somehow managed to look basically the same even 40 years later. Keep in mind that Plutarch is only 68 years old here. He went from looking like this to this in 40 years, where Elizabeth went from looking like this to this. Zephaniah also went from looking like this to this in only 28 years. Meanwhile, Barnabas Hale and Elizabeth managed to barely age at all. Quite the interesting coincidence
Australium, dude.
Elizabeth
it's Australium.
would then go on to convince
Australium,
to also build Redmond Man a life-extending device in order to prolong the gravel war. She does this by offering him 100 pounds of Australium, an incredibly rare and super powerful element primarily found in Australia, which she claims to have been amassing over the past decade, though that part may have been a lie, or it may have just been retconned later on. Either way, at this point we know that Elizabeth is one of very few people outside of Australia to know what Australium is, and the extent of the power that it can have. Helen, in the 1960s, is also shown to have an interest in Australium. During the Pyromania update in 2012, we learned that TF Industries underbid every space program in the United States in order to secure the rights to send Poopy Joe, the American monkeynaut, into space. And in turn, the United States would supply Manco with its entire supply of Australium to use as a power source. However, when it came time to actually launch the rocket with Poopy Joe aboard, the administrator had the Australium swapped with gravel water, and the rocket would tragically explode.
Oh! Rest in peace, Poopy Joe. Rest in peace.
And this whole Poopy Joe fiasco would lead to a Senate investigation on the subject, where Saxon Hale, Miss Pauling, and the administrator would appear to testify. And during this trial, she reveals what she plans to do with the Australium that the government had given her, to their shock and terror. And what she actually said is a mystery to us. However, Miss Pauling is present at the trial, and we would later learn that even she doesn't know what the administrator wants the Australium for. So it is possible that whatever she said was a lie. Or it's possible that this isn't even Miss Pauling. We never actually see this person's face, and we do know that most people working for the administrator have the same purple dress code, so it could be someone else. But the real world answer here is probably just that they didn't think that far ahead. I'm sure that when it was drawn, it was probably intended to be Miss Pauling.
It's all a big
just meant
pile
to be a
of
hint
crap.
that the administrator had grander and more sinister ambitions that we weren't meant to be privy to at that point in time.
Yeah, I know.
I personally don't think the administrator revealed the real reason why she needed Australian.
Yeah, that's the thing. The 7th comic is good and all, but it felt rushed. Like they just wanted to tie everything up real quick and be done with it. It just seemed kind of like an anticlimactic ending.
To anybody. So the best explanation here is just that she lied. And we'll see going forward that there are a few inconsistencies regarding the administrator's backstory and the entire TF2 plotline as a whole. I mean, according to this Saxon Hale postcard, the Poopy Joe rocket launch took place in 1962. But we would later learn that the TF2 mercenaries were involved in that launch, and as far as we're aware, they weren't active in the gravel war until 1968. Though it is possible that they've been doing it longer than we think. But by this point in 2012, we know that the administrator is named Helen, She stole the United States' entire supply of Australium for mysterious reasons, and she controls TF Industries, which itself controls Manco. The first time we ever even heard of Manco, it was already labeled as a division of TF Industries. So yeah, Manco, the mega corporation that has its own space program, the one that makes basically everything, the company that has 306 plants, office buildings, warehouses, and outlet malls in the Badlands area alone, is just part of TF Industries, which has some pretty big implications on the level of power the administrator actually has.
That's true.
In the map of Coal Town, the secretarial alcove even shows that they have a protocol for when the United States president calls Manco asking to speak with her. So what's going on there? Is she giving orders to the president? Is the president taking orders from an evil billionaire? I thought this was a fictional universe. And while it was always hinted that the TF2 mercenaries were a smaller part of a bigger story, comics like The Contract make it very clear that Manco serves a more elite clientele as well. For example, in The Naked and the Dead, the Team Fortress Classic Heavy mentions a few of the Administrator's other teams of mercenaries, including Team Echelon, Team Citadel, and Team Ajax. Though the original version said Team Vanguard, but that was swapped to Ajax when the new comic came out. And we would see a glimpse of these teams and what kind of equipment they work with when the mercenaries enter the Administrator's headquarters in the Days of Worn Away. With the implication being that there are mercenary teams A through F, and that we just follow Team Fortress.
Yeah.
Though exactly what TF and TF
Looks like the others were all wiped out, though.
is still a mystery. I'm sure the original idea was that it stood for Team Fortress, but in the lore that doesn't exactly make sense anymore. But I always enjoyed getting the little glimpses of the other people working under the Administrator, like these shadowy henchmen, or the guys in suits who probably run the day-to-day operations. Maybe some of them are the Miss Paulings for the other teams. It just gives a little bit more insight into how massive of an operation the Administrator is actually running.
Yeah.
But one of only a few people known to rival the Administrator's power was revealed in 2012's Man vs. Machine plotline, where Grey Man resurfaces, kills his brothers, and plans to take over Manco. Though the Administrator does play a surprisingly small role in the Man vs. Machine arc. She isn't even mentioned in Blood Brothers or A Fate Worse Than Chess. However, it was during this plotline that the rest of Zephaniah Man's will was uncovered, revealing that Zephaniah had left his miracle gravel to Elizabeth for safekeeping after Grey Man had resurfaced and attempted to blackmail his father for it. That miracle gravel, of course, actually being Australium, and some of which we saw Elizabeth give to Radigan Conager to build the life-extending machines for Redmond and Plutarch. In fact, in that very same comic, we see that Radigan actually ended up building a third life-extending machine at an unknown time for an unknown individual. Of course, once Grey Man was revealed, there was speculation that it could have been for him, but Grey Man is also like a super genius, and has his own much more advanced life-extending device built into his back, meaning that he much more likely made that for himself. And alright, I've been playing it off a little bit, but for most of us, it was pretty clear from the very beginning that somehow Elizabeth was Helen. She wasn't just an ancestor that whole time. So it is possible that the third life-extending machine also might have been for her. But after Grey Man succeeds in taking over Manco, he turns his attention to the Administrator when he finds out that Manco's Australian vault had been emptied. And with Manco no longer under her control, we see the Administrator go into hiding, with Grey Man then hiring the Team Fortress Classic mercenaries to track her down. And while they never go into it, these would have been the same mercenaries that she was overseeing in the 1930s. So it is possible that they would have known who she was, and might have been part of the reason why Grey Man hired them to begin with. Then, in the comic Blood in the Water, we see a rapidly aging Administrator inform Miss Pauling that she has obtained nearly all of the 89,000 known tons of Australium in existence, and that she wants Miss Pauling and the mercenaries to find the last cache. That same comic would reveal to us that Helen has her own Australium-fueled life-extending device built into her arm. But with the Australium running out, the engineer informs her that when it's gone, she'll die. But she says she only needs a little bit more time to settle an old debt. A debt that she's never told anybody about. Not Miss Pauling, and not the engineer, whose family has been working for her for generations. And with the last of the remaining Australium at her disposal, she de-ages herself to finally settle that debt once and for all.
I was so hoping
that
for something
debt
awesome.
Against Zephaniah Mann. Well, we found out that part after a 7-year-long break. But as it turns out, Zephaniah Mann, who we all thought was dead from the very first time we saw him, was actually alive this entire time.
It's been 7 years!
In an email to Jay Pinkerton, one of the writers for the comics,
I thought it was awesome,
the final comics
those fuckers are back! Yeah, I thought they were going for good.
It's been 7 years! Up to her wanting to seek revenge. But it was scrapped for being too dark, too boring, and too long. The final comic was to tell the Administrator's entire backstory, to reveal everything that led up to her wanting to seek revenge. But it was scrapped for being too dark, too boring, and too long. According to them, at least. I mean, I do feel like most of us would have wanted to know. But the comic, The Days of Worn Away, starts with several dramatic pictures of the Administrator as a young girl crying over various people who have been killed in different ways. The eventual implication being that Zephaniah Mann was the one responsible.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I suppose that is a good enough reason Zephaniah Mann.
See, this scene right here, though, because the veins, not in the, you can see them, they're kind of green. So it would almost, I would get the impression that these guys were experimenting with, not Australium, but Brazilium. Because they had that whole thing, because Brazilium is said to be like, it's like Australium, but it's green, it has slightly different properties. And is mostly found in Brazil. Though we also now know that Australium, even in large quantities, can be found in America because Soldier literally had a whole freaking cave of it. So, there's still so much we don't know about what was going on. There's so many loose ends in this story.
Mann was the one responsible. And ultimately, I suppose that is a good enough recap. We don't need to know all the details. That was never really the point. But at the same time, knowing that we could have had a full backstory that included more lore behind Silas Mann and Barnabas Hale, and a bunch of other random characters, almost like we were cheated. I mean, I would have loved to see that, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, but it is what it is.
Yes!
And at this point in the video, rather than just recapping the final comic, let's work it into a timeline of all the important events in the Administrator's life. Elizabeth, who probably isn't actually named Elizabeth, is born sometime in the late 1700s or possibly early 1800s. Most likely in England, given her close proximity to the Mann family, who were English. At some point, when she's a child, Zephaniah Mann is in some way responsible for the death of at least 6 of her loved ones, and Elizabeth would vow revenge on Zephaniah.
Or her parents.
On September 2nd, 1822, Redmond, Blutarch, and Grey Man are born. Grey is abducted by eagles, and their mother dies in childbirth.
What the fuck?
Elizabeth, who is now an adult, gets a job as the Mann family governess, apparently already being aware of the birth of the Mann brothers. And Elizabeth's job would be to mold the 2 reigning Mann brothers into champions, ruthless businessmen like their father, where one will eventually triumph over the other and become the rightful heir to the Mann family fortune. And while she initially planned to kill Redmond and Blutarch, the Administrator instead raised them to fight and hate each other. Sometime, probably in the 1840s, Elizabeth convinces the Mann family to buy land in the Badlands of New Mexico and to move there. In 1850, Zephaniah writes a will on his deathbed, leaving Elizabeth his estate and the family supply of Australium after she had worked for him for 28 years. After Zephaniah dies, Elizabeth returns to Mann Manor, which she now owns. Over time, she begins to feel that her life has no meaning anymore and becomes depressed. As she's about to hang herself, Grey Man appears, and she hangs herself anyway. Only for Grey to revive her using Australium. Grey Man is well aware of who Elizabeth is and what she has done, but is only interested in the miracle gravel that Zephaniah left her. And after explaining it to her that it can both extend life up to and past the point of death, she decides to keep it for herself. Sometime later, Elizabeth returns to New Mexico, and in 1890, she convinces Radigan Conacher to build a second life-extending machine for Redmond Man, as well as a third one for someone else.
She had one already for herself,
It's not entirely known who this third machine was for, but I personally believe that it was probably for Zephaniah, who she had previously dug up. Between 1850 and 1971, the Administrator oversees the Gravel War, spanning multiple generations of mercenaries. At some point, Elizabeth begins primarily going by Helen, and creates TF Industries, which itself acquires Manco and becomes one of the largest organizations in the world. During this time, she may or may not have had a romantic relationship with Manco's eventual CEO,
I don't want to think about
Saxon
that.
Hay.
That sounds horrible.
In 1962, Manco attempts to send Poopy Joe into space using the American government's supply of Australium. The Administrator has it stolen and testifies before the Senate. After Grey Man takes control of Manco, she goes into hiding and uses this time to obtain as much Australium as she can. And when Grey Man is defeated, and there's no more known Australium left, she uses her remaining supply to see Zephaniah face to face one last time. But with the Australium finally gone, they both turn to dust. Why did she do it?
Not gone.
Even she can't remember. But prior to the Zephaniah
cop-out
reveal, there was a lot of speculation as to what the Administrator's ultimate goal was.
Yeah.
We know how powerful Australium is as an element, and we know that Grey Man's goal is generally world domination. He claims that what Helen would do is worse than what he would have done, but there's no real reason to believe he actually knew. He was most likely just lying.
Not that he was lying, it's just that he suspected, because ultimately, you think about it, he was afraid of her. He knew she was more conniving than even he was. To him, she was the only real threat. So, yeah, I'm pretty sure he just... I don't think he was lying, I think he just assumed. He was assuming it would be worse than whatever he was cooking.
The Administrator had a massive network of shell companies, henchmen, assistants, multiple teams of mercenaries, and probably the largest manufacturer in the world in Manco. Basically, an entire empire that she built, all dedicated to keeping Blutarch, Redmond, and Zephaniah Mann alive. Her goal was never for world domination, because she had effectively already achieved that anyway.
Yeah.
And a world domination plotline would have been very underwhelming from a story and character perspective, as well as not especially unique. She was already one of the most powerful people in the world and was pulling strings everywhere.
See, this is why I would have thought it would have been more interesting if all of this was hidden and everything, because she was preparing for something. She was preparing for a greater threat. Like, there was already a shadow organization out there, and she was creating her own shadow organization to stop them. And that even though, like, because it would have been an interesting twist, because everybody has suspected that she was this evil bitch, and she kind of was, but everyone was suspecting it, and it would have been interesting to twist all around to find out that she was the good guy all along. She was doing it to protect people, to save the world. That would have been way more interesting. She wasn't trying to conquer it. She was trying to save everyone. That would have been one hell of a twist. And would have segued very nicely into Team Fortress 3.
That was always just a side effect of her real mission, which was to make Zephaniah Man suffer. To force him to live for all eternity in a decaying state and watch his moron sons never succeed. She needed resources in order to do that, and would do anything she had to get them. And that's what she spent her entire life on. But it was worth it. Dedicating over 150 years to a grudge. I can respect that.
I can respect that.
All of the events of TF2 would lead back to that one grudge. And while there are some inconsistencies and plot holes and retconning here and there, it seems clear to me that they had some general idea of what the Administrator's arc was going to be all the way back to 2009. It just took them 15 years to finally finish it. As soon as we saw her, we were given that mystery of how she managed to stay alive for 150 years. And while part of me hopes that someday we do finally get her full backstory, not only is it unlikely, but the outcome remains basically the same. It's the story of someone who committed their entire life to anger and vengeance against one person, and the lengths that she would go to make that person suffer the way he made her suffer. All for her to do it for so long that she can't even remember why. But let's be real, Zephaniah kinda deserved it.
He was a dick. He was a massive dick.
And that was the complete history of the Administrator. The only one of the series that is now truly complete. I've been asked a bunch of times if I'm going to go back and redo the other videos in the series now that the final comic is out. And I've thought about it a lot, but I'm not really sure they're worth remaking in their entirety.
No,
I was thinking
not
maybe of
really.
just doing a part 2. Like the History of Scout part 2. Or maybe I could just make
There
an
isn't
epilogue
really much,
video.
with one
Or maybe
comic,
I
there
will
isn't
redo
really
it
a
in
lot
I'm
extra
not sure.
history for these guys.
You guys will have to let me know what you think.
I mean, hell, some of them don't
And I
even
was
have
also thinking of
lines in
making
the
a video
final comic.
going over all the loose ends and inconsistencies in the story as a whole.
Oh,
and I think
God.
that could be fun, you know, trying to make things fit together
There's
that were
a
obviously
metric
not super well planned
fuckload
out.
of
So yeah, you can let me know.
inconsistencies and loose ends.
But
and
thanks for
that's
watching,
pissing me off.
and a special thanks to my patrons like Varric, Captain Forex, Eggox, Colonel, Polyvinegar, Caponicus, Kelso the Pirate, Pillsman's Fox, Some Crazy Idiot, Ozon,
Some
Evil
crazy
Toaster,
idiot.
Salt God, Lobby,
crazy
Cope,
idiot.
Time Consuming, Man344, Nolan46, and Melodici.
Okie dokie. So there you go, guys. It's over. Kind of a bittersweet thing, but yeah, there we go. Anyway, guys, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Like this video, subscribe. Definitely click on the link to the original in the description. Like the original. And sub to Squim Jim's channel. And guys, please help me. I'm trying to get this channel to 150,000 subscribers by the end of the year. Come on, help me to give a big middle finger to YouTube for not giving me my silver play button. And I will see you guys next time. Tune in every day for new content. Bye-bye.